Matthias has already pointed out, this is the biggest mission that the EU has ever overtaken. There are 1,700 internationals and 1,100 local staff deployed, and the budget is well over 100 million a year, so it eats up almost a third of the CSDP budget. It is also the first venture of the European Union into the area of state building. The UN has lots of experience in this field, and it's very clear now, the record is very mixed. It's very clear this is one of the toughest things that the international community can undertake. We're still very bad at it collectively, and it was an interesting test for the European Union how well we will perform. At the time when we discussed EULEX first, 2007, maybe 2006, 2007, I was working very closely with Matthias Desari, and one must say that he was quite skeptical. His preference would have been a much lighter mission without executive powers. He said the experience of Bosnia and Kosovo showed us that we're really no good at this. We're destroying more capacity than we're really creating. We should be a lot more careful. But the member states made very, very clear that they, while they thought very much that Kosovo has to be independent, or the majority of them at least, they also mistrusted the Kosovo institutions. They felt there has to be a big, strong mission with executive powers that can address the crucial issues that are around there, mainly the lack of the rule of law. Now, it's almost exactly 3 years that the EULEX declared itself operational, and in these 3 years it encountered any amount of criticism, basically. One could say, actually, the one function that it fulfills to perfection is that of a scapegoat. Because the Kosovo Albanians blame it for not having delivered enough in terms of fighting organized crime and corruption. This is echoed also by large parts of the international community. The Kosovo Serbs blame it for not being fully status neutral, particularly in its activities in the north. The Kosovo Albanians blame it for being not sufficiently supportive when they tried to extend the authority of the Pristina institutions into the north. And there's also a sometimes rather unattractive blame game going on among the various international actors. Now, I must say, we know already from biblical times that the role of scapegoat is an extremely useful role in society, but by definition it's also rather thankless. Moreover, it's not in the mandate of the mission. If you look at the mandate of the mission, it's very idealistic in a way. It will assess the Kosovo authorities, the judicial authorities, and law enforcement agencies in their progress towards sustainability and accountability. It will further develop and strengthen an independent and multi-ethnic justice system and a multi-ethnic police and customs service, ensuring that these institutions are free from political interference and adhering to international recognized standards and European best practices. The mission, in full cooperation with the European Commission assistance programs, will implement its mandates of monitoring, mentoring, and advising while retaining certain executive responsibilities. So it's already mentioned here the three components. One is the relatively small component on customs that worked rather well in training the customs services of Kosovo. It potentially has an important role in the north, but it cannot fulfill this role for reasons that I'm going to come to. But by far the biggest part of the operation is the police component. It's particularly big because, and that in my view was probably a mistake, the member states decided under pressure from NATO to include a very strong anti-riot capability. There are 4 companies, IPU, FPU units from various states supporting this operation. In the meantime, 3 of these 4 companies have disappeared, not as a matter of some EU planning or decision making, but simply because the countries in charge have withdrawn them from Kosovo. It's not a huge loss because it became quite clear in the last 3 years that this anti-riot component is not really needed in the south. The Kosovo police is quite capable to do this job by itself, and it's insufficient to really secure the north. It has become very clear that KFOR cannot escape its role as a responder to this type of security threats. The rest of the police operation there of EULEX has been reasonably successful. I think the Kosovo police developed relatively positively over the past 3 years. An example is that they were able to take over the protection of quite a number of Serb religious sites from NATO, which wouldn't have been easy without a very strong monitoring and mentoring from the European Union. But of course, altogether, as Mr. Frischenschlager knows very well, the Kosovo police is actually one of the stronger institutions of Kosovo. It has been trained by OSCE over a number of years, and its capacity is relatively positive. Of course, it's still lacking in the more difficult areas of policing work, but altogether it's not too bad. The weakest part of the Kosovo institutional framework is clearly the judiciary, and it is in this area where there's the biggest gap between the expectations on EULEX and the actual deliverables. Some of this criticism, I think, is unfair. I think it's very, very difficult to overestimate the difficulty of the task that EULEX faces in this area. There is no tradition, basically, for effective state institutions in Kosovo. It's never happened, not in the Turkish times, not later, not in Yugoslav times. And the primary loyalty of a person in Kosovo is towards his family and towards the clan and this type of structure. So the willingness to cooperate, particularly with internationals on sensitive issues of crime, is very, very limited. And there is, unfortunately, a strong tradition of pressure against witnesses, threats, this sort of thing. In September, one of the key witnesses in a very prominent case against Fabio Lima, a war crimes case, committed suicide in Germany as part of he was part of a witness protection program. And this, I think, showed how difficult this area is in this regard. It was a big blow also, of course, on the prestige of EULEX. And there are also, one must say, important links between the crime world and parts of the political establishment in Kosovo. And that doesn't make the work of EULEX easier. One also has to say that UNMEC, the predecessor organization in the rule of law field, performed quite badly. Did not achieve much progress over the almost 10 years when it was in charge. And the transition from UNMEC to EULEX was a very messy one. It was not smooth and it was not very cooperative. It was a very complicated time, of course. EULEX representatives also point out, I think with some justification, that there are hundreds of investigations going on, and they point out that also in countries as developed as Switzerland and the UK, it takes sometimes a number of years until these investigations arrive to start a trial. So they think, and say with some justification, it's just hugely unrealistic to expect EULEX to deliver with its 35 judges and 20 prosecutors a breakthrough in the rule of law front within this short period of time. But it's also true, of course, that the performance of EULEX has important weaknesses, and some of the factors for this are clearly for the EU itself. It's the responsibility of the EU itself. I think one of the crucial weaknesses is the recruitment procedure. EULEX has been understaffed from the very beginning. It never reached, particularly in the area of the judiciary, the number of staff that was initially planned. There's also a big problem in the terms of stay of the officials in Kosovo. It's such a complicated society, the legal situation is messy, you need to build up personal partnership and relationship with the Kosovo institutions, and you can't do this within a year. So, and that is hugely undercutting the effectiveness of the mission, that people are staying much too short a time. A third, more sensitive issue is, of course, quality. It's obvious that the high flyers among the prosecutors and the judges of Europe are unlikely to end up in Pristina. There are some extremely good people there, but many of them, frankly, are not so good. And so the combination of understaffing, short terms of stay, and sometimes lacking quality is a huge handicap for the mission. I think a big problem also is procurement. I think the EU was just not equipped to be the back office for such an important and big mission, and this had a huge delaying effect and on the way things are done there. Big problem is the chain of command. I had a big fight with Javier Solana about this issue. My feeling was when this mission was set up that the EUSR, the special representative, should have a strong role within the chain of command to ensure the coherence of the EU policy on the ground. Javier Solana felt very strongly that you need a strong headquarter in Brussels, and you have to keep the EUSR's roles very minimal. He can offer local advice, but not a real input into the decision-making of the mission. You can guess who won the fight. And I don't mind that so much because you can have very good arguments for this strong headquarter in Brussels. But unfortunately, it hasn't worked very well as it is. I think the mission has frequently felt not fully supported by Brussels, and Brussels has frequently felt not sufficiently consulted, and there was not a real successful cooperation between these two ends. Then there are, in fact, that the two leaders of the mission were generals, both generals who insisted very much that this is a purely technical mission, and was, one might say, a somewhat problematic concept in a place where everything is political. So in a way that also created some problems. Then there's of course the ambiguity in the mandate. When the EU realized that we wouldn't have a Security Council resolution on the status of Kosovo, and that the EU will be divided among those who recognize and those who don't recognize, we faced basically a division and sort of a foreign policy catastrophe similar to the one on Iraq, on the Iraq war. I think it was a clever decision basically to say, okay, we go separate ways in terms of recognition, but we act together and coherently while running this operation together. And the decision on the joint action was taken, I think, 2 days before the declaration of independence of Kosovo in order to secure the unity of the 27 countries. And that was, I think, the right approach, but of course it had its downside. The downside is that the mission was status neutral. It created real problems in terms of the applicable law. For those who did not recognize Kosovo, there was no question that the legislation of the Kosovo Assembly was not really relevant, and of course for those who had, it was very obvious that it could not be Serb legislation. So I think the EULEX was quite creative and altogether successful in overcoming this sort of handicap, but it's a continuous problem that has never been fully resolved. The final big problem is the certain incoherence within the international community. Particularly, I must say, between EULEX and the United States. The United States is part of EULEX, it offers officers, but it runs its own progress on the side. And I think particularly in the last few years, it has happened rather frequently that the US ambassador and the head of EULEX did not have exactly the same view of things. And this is a big problem in Kosovo because, of course, the US enjoys tremendous authority over the Pristina authorities, and this also, to some extent, undercut the authority of EULEX. Now, on the north, I'll be very brief. It's sort of a chapter of its own. I think the first big challenge was to get EULEX into the north, and that was the last thing I was really involved in the Council Secretariat. Successfully in the end, President Tadic accepted the deployment all over Kosovo on the assurance that this is done within the scope of 1244 and within the scope, as the wording was, of the status neutral approach of the United Nations. So EULEX did deploy. It managed to establish border control also in the north which to some extent managed to reduce the smuggling that was going on after the declaration of independence. It managed to establish a presence in all the police stations in the north. It managed to re-establish the court in North Mitrovica. And altogether it was gradually and slowly moving in the right direction. But of course all these achievements were lost very quickly after the 25th of July, after Thaci decided unilaterally, without prior consultation with his international partners, to try to take over the border controls in the north by moving his own people towards this border post. This created a completely impossible situation for EULEX. The Kosovo Serbs reacted very violently, threw up barricades everywhere. And EULEX, in a way, was the host of this Kosovo authority representatives in these two border posts, lost its freedom of maneuver and freedom of movement in the north completely. And at this point, I think there's hardly any presence, except for these two border posts, which are sometimes called the Alamos, because of isolated EULEX outposts, which of course are anything than border posts, because they are somehow rather sort of camps surrounded by rather hostile forces. Now, since then, there has been some sort of a cat and mouse game between KFOR and the Kosovo Serbs, taking down barricades, building new barricades, building alternative roads that circumvent the roads that are blocked and turning them down. And one must say that KFOR did not exactly win this fight so far, mainly of course because it does not want to use lethal power, does not want to kill people. And in this situation, if you have such a policy of restraint, you're not very successful normally. There has been an effort, and Robert's played a major role in this, in putting a lot of pressure on Belgrade to bring the situation under control. Worked up to a point. I think President Tadic made the right statements. They also managed in the end, in the last few days, this week, to pull down some of the barricades. But it has not been really successful, which is also due to the fact that the people in charge of the Serbs in the north are not the friends of President Tadic. I think they are followers of Koštunica and of the radicals. They are very much involved with organized crime, with the smuggling syndicates operating up there, and they want to bring the Democrats in Belgrade down, basically. So in the period before the elections, they're not exactly following the advice that they receive from Belgrade. But it's true that also the Belgrade, in a way, could have been done more and earlier than it has actually done. Now, my personal feeling is that the next 2012 should be the year when one really tries to find a sustainable solution of the North. And the solution of the North cannot be partition. That would be absolutely wrong. And I think the most sane parts of Belgrade have given up this option by now. But it also cannot be purely Ahtisaari. The Ahtisaari concept for the North was not bad. It has also been negotiated with the Serbs. It has never been accepted by the Serbs, but it had lots of input from them. It allows the Serbs living at a high degree of self-governance, but probably one needs more than the Ahtisaari concept has provided to reach a situation that is really locally acceptable and with which Pristina has to live, and also Belgrade. This, I think, is the big challenge of the year 2012. Now, a few words on the future of the mission. The current mandate runs out in the mid-2012. There's a process of strategic review going on at the present point. I think there is broad support for continuing the mission for maybe another 2 years, but it should be a much leaner and much smaller mission. I think in the police area, a lot can be reduced because a lot of the job has been done. I think in the judiciary, the approach should be much more focused, I think, on war crimes, on organized crime, on big corruption cases. One crucial, very important question will be whether executive powers will be maintained. I think there are some people in Kosovo, in the Kosovo institutions, who say that on such a sensitive issue as war crimes, the local authorities are not able to deal with it yet, but this is an open discussion. I think altogether, EULEX has a mixed record. There were some successes, there are some failures. I think altogether it had a sobering effect on the European Union. In terms of the amount of the investment, and if you look at the output, I think the EU is less likely to engage in similar ambitious ventures of state building as EULEX. I think for Kosovo, of course, establishing the rule of law remains a hugely important priority for the local people, but also for the international partners, of course, who have strong interest in this area. I think in the medium term, the lead on this should really go to the European Commission. I think if this, the need for furthering the rule of law is sort of linked up into the European perspective of Kosovo, moving gradually, very slowly in the case of Kosovo, but eventually towards membership in the European Union, we can engage a great deal more effectively than we can in the context of a CSTP operation. We have a lot more leverage than on the local authorities, and we also have a lot more time, because clearly introducing the rule of law is not a matter of 1, 2, 3 years, it's a matter of a generation, and it will need a great deal of European support. Thank you very much.